Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Tracy Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Thanks so much for being here for another week. This week, we are going to continue talking about relationships. We've been talking about it a lot throughout the 2025 season, so to speak, even though I don't have seasons to my podcast because it's just evergreen. But, relationships are a big part of things, as is trust. And so in order to keep this conversation going, I have Tracy Lalonde with me. So you have two Tracys for the price of one in this week's episode, which is so amazing. We spell our names differently, but still, you get what I'm saying. So let me tell you a little bit about Tracy. With 30 plus years in training, consulting, and professional development, Tracy Lalonde's courses, keynotes, and guidance propel professionals to success. From her early days in the consulting industry to her transition to the legal field, Tracy's career has always been focused on helping others grow. She's the author of the Joychiever Journey, Alleviate Burnout, and Design Your Life for More Joy. This roadmap helps cultivate a better work-life balance, setting the stage for a happier and more fulfilling career. And in her latest book, Trust Me, The Insider's Guide to Being a Go-To Person at Work, she prepares readers to elevate their standing and effectiveness. Welcome, Tracy. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Tracy. Appreciate it.
Of course. Isn't it funny to say your own name to someone else?
Yes.
It's almost as if you're looking in the mirror. You're like, hello, Tracy. And then the mirror responds back, hello, Tracy, how are you? But actually, we're two different people. It's such a nuanced thought, but it's just, it's not every day you meet another Tracy. So,
Yeah, exactly.
I love it. So as I kind of queued us up in the beginning of this recording, relationships and trust are two very important things. They obviously go hand in hand. Where did, this Joychiever journey, and where did just in general these concepts and the importance of these concepts first kind of come about for you in your life and in your career?
Well, the Joychiever journey came about from my own personal experience with burnout. And so from, in particular, 2006 to 2016, I was traveling 40 weeks a year, 3 cities a week, 5 to 9 airplanes a week. Loved what I was doing, but the lifestyle was literally killing me. And so I ended up leaving the profession and a firm that I was a partner with and thought I'd be at forever to just heal and recover. And out of that came the book, The Joychiever Journey, because I thought what I really want to help people with is how to prevent, the same fate that I fell prey to, because I had the good fortune to be able to take some time off, but not everybody does. And that's not necessarily the way to go about it. And so that really forced me to think about and help others have a deeper introspection into, number one, what makes a human more joyful, and two, how to recognize those decision moments, because we high achieving individuals have a propensity to just default to work. There's the emails to do, the next task to be done. Right. And I want us to more take those moments, say at 5:30 in an evening. I said I was going to go have dinner with people I care about versus tackle the 5 more emails that came in of like, okay, there are some times when you do need to tackle the emails, or other times when you really need to go do what you said you're going to do in your social life and your personal life. And it's going to be more fulfilling. So that's where that started. And then the trust thing has evolved. And this came about last year in just even some of my own content, where we talk so much about how important trust is, but yet no one really teaches anybody how. And so the book and the corresponding keynote to it really is an emphasis on how to build trust, be trustworthy, repair trust, build trust when you're remote with someone, all those kinds of dynamics. And I'm aiming it at a colleague to colleague perspective, because where it's talked about most is manager to employee, but you really wanted a 360.
Yeah, it's a good point. I was reflecting there for a moment, like you're right. How do you build trust? And I remember early in my career, when I was working at Target, and we always called it getting the buy-in. Like, getting the buy-in was like the very first thing that you did when you stepped foot into a new store or you started on a new team, or whatever it was, because I did work in store. And when I reflect on that, getting the buy-in, obviously that means establish trust. Um, I remember being taught that you just have to get to know other people first. You have to go in without any ulterior motive. Don't try to coach anyone. Don't. And I remember in Target, like, the leaders would teach this to us. Don't coach anyone. Don't try to fix problems unless, like, someone's, really asking for help. Just go in and try and get to know people and allow them to get to know you. And I'm realizing now, actually, I think for the first time I'm reflecting on this, that they were teaching us about vulnerability and
Mm,
how vulnerability is a huge
mhm.
uh, builder of trust. Would you agree? Like, what are your thoughts on that
Yeah, yeah,
idea?
well, vulnerability as well as empathy.
Mm,
So,
mhm.
that was the word that was coming to mind as you were talking about the specific example is get to know people is like so you can put yourself in their shoes later on, which also does require vulnerability. And trust also requires vulnerability because trust is implicitly a risk. So
Mhm.
I'm going to trust you with a piece of information, something personal about myself, admitting I made
Right.
a mistake. I have to make myself vulnerable in order for the trust to even have an opportunity to establish. So
Right.
I 100% agree with you in that way. So you got to get to know people so that you can be vulnerable with them and they feel
Yeah.
comfortable being vulnerable with you.
Absolutely. I appreciate you kind of being the mirror there, because you do kind of have to show someone that you can be trusted. And I think that that might be, it's been a while since we first chatted, but I think that that might have been one of the things that we had spoken about, that you have to show people that you are someone who they could potentially trust. And some people are just inherently distrusting. They
Yeah,
meet you,
I know.
especially yeah, especially if you're from the Northeast like me in the New York metro area. You don't really trust anyone. So, we have a propensity for just saying, maybe not. But obviously I'm adding levity there, but in reality it's like, I'm someone that tends to trust more easily, but I'm married to someone who doesn't really trust so easily. And he's probably more likely than not a reflection of the majority of people. And
Yeah.
so how do you, right? So it's like, how do you take yourself and put yourself in a situation where you're willing to be vulnerable first?
Well, and it's the classic age old question, should trust be earned or should trust be given?
Mm,
And and in the Northeast, many people feel like trust should be earned.
right, right.
And so, here's the physiological dynamic that for those folks who are staunch and the trust has got to be earned, they don't let happen. Because what happens is when I extend trust to you, do one of the things I mentioned, I share a mistake, I let you take the lead, whatever that is. What that does for you in your brain is it releases oxytocin. So it gets firing off, and oxytocin is the bonding or known as the love hormone, if you will. So that makes you
Mm,
feel good. And it incents you to trust me in return, which then kicks off the oxytocin in my brain, which then wants me to trust you again. And then you trust me. So we get this nice reciprocal relationship going.
mhm.
That's why I suggest to people of like, hey, you want to give it. Now, I'm not going to give you to the numbers to my bank account right away, but I'm gonna take that risk. And I think for folks who are believing that trust needs to be earned first, they're more risk adverse and they're not
Yeah.
willing to even take small steps towards it because it's almost like you have to prove yourself kind of thing, but yet they're not giving anybody an opportunity to prove themselves. So then you end up alone.
Yeah, totally. This is really reminiscent in I want to say reminiscent conversations, but also reminiscent in recent decisions from companies who are saying, "Hey, employees, return to the office full time, full stop. Like, no questions asked, no, discussion." And sure, companies can almost do anything that they want, almost, obviously, within reason. I do think just for myself, working for a remote company, I can reflect on this directly. I've heard from colleagues of mine that say openly that being in a remote environment, to them, that means that there is an inherent trust that the company has on the employees. And so when I reflect on that, it's like, well, these companies who go back fully in person, they may trust their employees, but the message that's sent when this decision is super top down and there isn't a whole lot of communication or collaboration, at least from the outside looking in, because most people are like, this doesn't really, work for us. This isn't really what people want. There's that inherent message of distrust because a lot of the argument is like, you'll be more productive. You'll see, more people doing their work. And it's like, there's this warped idea that you have to see someone working in order to understand that they're working. But
Yeah.
actually, you run your business, right? Whether someone watches you run your business or not, you are running it.
Yeah.
So it's very counterintuitive, but I do think that it sends a message of mistrust or distrust, even if a company doesn't intend it.
Wholeheartedly, because it's lacking in transparency or openness. So we're not giving people a reason why necessarily, or good enough reasons why, that they now suddenly need to be remote or have to go from remote into coming inside completely. Um, it also questions people's competence. I
Mhm.
don't think you actually do the job unless I can put eyes on you. Now, I will admit it takes a little bit of transition time. I've
Mhm.
managed folks remotely too, and at first, when you don't know them very well, I had a new virtual assistant work for me, and I had to have faith that she was going to do what she said she was going to do, because that's another component of
Yeah.
trust is integrity. Um,
Yeah.
but once you learn as a manager to be clear around what you expect, when you expect it, and how you're going to communicate in the process throughout, it becomes much easier. But I'll give you a perfect example that speaks exactly to what you're talking about. So there was a high performing employee coming out of COVID. The company had a guideline of, hey, it'd be great if you could be in the office 2 days a week. And that employee was coming pretty regularly 3 days a week because he preferred it. He felt like he was more productive. He had little kids at home, all
Mhm.
that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
As it evolved, the company decided to mandate, and literally called it a mandate,
Ugh.
to be 3 days a week. This is exactly what that fellow was doing, but he was livid. He no
Mhm.
longer felt trusted. Same outcome, but just the whole framing of it as I'm telling you, I'm mandating, I'm not giving a reason for it. And he now is perceived that he's lost flexibility. So it's a lose proposition for him. Created all kinds of angst, and I don't know what ended up happening with the fellow, but it wouldn't surprise me if he started looking elsewhere, because it was just such a shift in
Totally.
trust of his ability to do his job, and the performance was no different whatsoever.
Totally. And for listeners or members of the audience who are watching this as a video, you will have seen that I was making a lot of faces when Tracy was sharing that, because there is something to be said about mandating something. It makes me want to say, raise your hand if you've ever liked being told what to do. And like,
Mhm.
none of us are raising our hands. You're not, I'm not. I'm sure none of the listeners are like, oh, yeah, I love being told what to do. Maybe there's like 1% of the population that really likes direction. I don't know. But when we think about like the optics and also the message that's being sent, yeah, here you have someone in your example who was already doing that because it's what worked for him. Um, and then you have the company who's really kind of taking an iron fist to things. And I just think, it begs the question of, do companies want to be like employee friendly? Do they want to have, an added sense of levity, an added sense of comfort for their employees in order to maximize productivity in that way? Or do they want to be really serious? And in that seriousness, do they want to be very formal and structured? Certainly, there are some companies that prefer the latter, and that's okay. I'm sure you and I are thinking about industries that tend to be or tend to lean more conservatively in their operations. That's totally okay. The thing is that when people sign on to work for these companies with one maybe idea, or even as things have shifted over time, like COVID was a big landmark for this, they've become accustomed to a different way of working, a new way of working, a more flexible way of working. Then when you almost regress and you change that, there has to be change management. And you can't just start mandating things. It's like anything else.
Well,
Yeah,
and the
interesting.
and the folks who've been working, entered the workplace since 2025, they don't know any different.
Mm,
So I
okay.
totally resonate with your change management idea. It's like it's not like going back to anything because they weren't here before that,
Right.
But the two other thoughts I have about what you said too is it reminds me of motivation. And in this scenario I gave, it moved from being intrinsically motivated to be at work 3 days a week to now being extrinsically motivated.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Mm-hmm.
and as numerous studies, and I'm reminded of Daniel Pink's book Drive, will show you those external motivators just aren't as effective. Full stop.
Yeah.
Just aren't effective. And so, my husband and I, the second point I was thinking about, we've had the debate over the years because he runs a business, and some positions were able to work remotely during COVID. Some had to still come into their facilities. And he went back to being in the office full time. And he said, but I have the productivity numbers to show that we perform better when we're all together. And I said, well, because that's the difference. That's a huge difference because he has data that he can then present to the team to say, we have proof of where we perform better. So it wasn't a going back into the office. It was a, hey, let's talk about it from a productivity perspective. Let me share some numbers with you team members. And they're like, okay, we got it. He's like, if
Mm-hmm.
you want to stay remote, we've got to improve those productivity numbers. And they're like, no, wait, we actually like being in the office with each other. Like it's more fun. It's more creative. We can brainstorm together. But it wasn't this, jam it down the throat kind of thing. It was a, here's the data. Let's talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I would like us to be in, but we do this together. So where are you at with it? And so it enabled people to be also involved in the decision making, which
Right.
goes a huge way in building trust as well.
Right. And you know what I was thinking about? Thank you for sharing that. Also, what I was thinking about when you were sharing is that openness, which is displayed in that example from your husband's experience, is a big part of building relationships and establishing trust and maintaining trust. Because in that story, we hear that there's mutual ownership and there's openness in feedback and just discussion. And those two things are not to be taken lightly. Like when people have mutual ownership, either in decisions or just in an organization, not only do they care more, but they have a say in the way forward. And and mutual ownership also drives accountability quite well because then it's not someone else's problem. It's not your husband's making this decision and everyone else is just having to deal with it. That's not what mutual ownership does. So when there's openness and there's dialogue and conversation, then people weigh in, and that does establish the ownership shared by everyone around that table. And so then it's like, well, if that decision is made and it's reflected on and there's another decision made after that reflection point, everyone is still a part of that decision, and then they're a part of the solution and they're a part of the problem depending on what that circumstance might be, which I think is oftentimes something that's lacking that can really break down trust in organizations. Because I'm sure you can think of an example too where you have a problem and someone is pointing the finger at that problem and then pointing the finger at who they think is part of the problem or who is the scapegoat or the cause of that problem, rather than being a part of whatever that thing is and then also helping to solve for it. It's like, how do we do this together?
Yeah, right. Well, and it also makes accountability a lot easier because
Hmm.
when there's a clear objective and there's joint ownership on getting to that objective, if the person who is taking the majority of the responsibility of getting there let me put it this way. If the outcome isn't accomplished, let's make it even better,
Mm-hmm.
then the conversation doesn't have to be a me versus you. The conversation is, okay, the outcome wasn't accomplished. What happened?
Right.
So it doesn't have to be about you human didn't do what you said you were going to do. It was, we were clear, you agreed, we're not where we thought we were going to be. Huh? And it just starts there. It's so much easier to have that kind of conversation than you're a terrible performer kind of discussion.
Yeah, totally. Who wants to have that one? I mean, this also leads me to a question for you, which is, and we kind of talked about, well, how do we build trust? I'm curious, and I think we've covered that, but how easily is trust broken, and what does the process of rebuilding trust look like?
Yeah. The person who leans toward trust needs to be earned, trust can break pretty easily because they're always skeptical,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
The one who freely gives it has a lot more tolerance for it. Um, I am trying to help people not write off another human being in their entirety if trust starts to erode for whatever reason. Let's use the classic though, like somebody makes a mistake or somebody doesn't do what they say they're going to do. So
Sure.
so for example, say that I'm going to provide you with some sort of deliverable on a certain day and time, and I don't give it to you on that day and time. And you could say, well, you know what? I just can't trust her. And
Mm.
that's where I'm like, hang on, wait. Is it me completely? Or what is it that you don't trust? Because by the way, my work quality is really good. Like that is reliable. What's not so great is my time management, my deadline, making my deadlines. And so I'm trying to encourage those people who have their trust broken to discern what it is very specifically that is creating that distrust, number one. And then number two, to give feedback to that person. Because I know, oh, I
Mhm.
can't trust you anymore. I'm not going to work with you if I have a choice.
Totally.
Done. Data complete. No. I need you to tell me, hey Trace, I need to talk to you about your deadlines because you're missing them. And it's causing me to not want to trust you on other things, but I need to isolate this for you. So can we talk about that and have an
Mhm.
open feedback conversation? And then what's important is you've got to give me more opportunities to rebuild that trust. Now, it's also, I am culpable. I have responsibility, but most people think about repairing trust from the perspective of the person who broke the trust. And
Right.
I want to tell people it's a two-way street, which makes sense in my physiological oxytocin situation. I'm trying to get that repaired. So it's got to be a mutual situation.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I do, when hearing your points, I do think about, that the ease in breaking that trust, or realizing that trust is broken and allowing it to just stay broken. And it makes me immediately think about managers who decide to terminate their employees. And coming back to actually my very first episode on this podcast 4 years ago, more than 4 years ago now, was about destigmatizing HR. And a big part of that is like helping people to realize, well, HR is not usually deciding who gets terminated. Like, we're not the ones managing all of these people. And so it does lead me to think about how when people have deeper connections with either their teams or the teams around them, their peers, there's it makes it more difficult to write people off like that. And so when I think about, how we establish trust, and as you've also shared about how easily trust is broken, I think those like personal relationships that we can have in the business or in a business can make it more deeply embedded, that level of trust that we do then establish. And for managers who are like, ah, this person's just not working out anymore, and I want to move through them, right? And there's like not a whole lot of uh conversation, and usually it's HR stepping in saying, well, you haven't spoken with them about their performance, you got to do all these things, like, and sometimes that's where the stigma comes in, that we're not really in this position of supporting a manager or the business, because we're, like we are always pigeonholed between these two things. Either we're too employee friendly or we're not employee friendly enough. And I share this because this is where the managers who have deeper relationships, when they do have trust broken, or there is some sort of, issue in that relationship, the deeper the connection with that person is, the harder it's going to be to just write someone off. So I like what you've shared around, the juxtaposition between someone who is of the mindset that trust is earned versus someone who says trust is given. Because it makes sense. It makes sense that there are, some people who are just like, okay, I'm done with this and I don't want to repair anything. And then there are people who potentially are in a trusting relationship with someone who feels opposite of them. You could have a manager who says trust is earned, and you can have a direct report who says trust is given. And that's probably a really difficult position to be in, right? Because
Yeah.
you're just always conflicting in some
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. And if the person who's giving the trust it doesn't get it in return, eventually they're going to stop, because that's just taking risk over
Sure.
and over and over again with no reward.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a risk with putting a lot of trust out there makes you so vulnerable, which I think is a great thing. But
Hmm.
when you're so vulnerable and you're not receiving vulnerability back, to your point, it's like, ooh, am I putting my neck out here for no reason?
Yeah.
What's going
Yeah.
on?
Trust doesn't work without vulnerability.
Yeah, yeah, it's so true. I really appreciate all of the examples and perspectives that you've shared. I'm wondering if there's any advice, like parting advice, let's say, that you have for the listeners who either are in a relationship that needs some trust building, or if maybe they struggle with being vulnerable or being open themselves, whether they're leaders or individual contributors. Like what advice do you have for them to maybe get their trust journeys or their journeys toward more trustworthiness started?
Yeah. I think it'd be a good exercise for folks to identify what I call your trust musts. And so I have 6 pillars of trust, and each of us have our priorities of how we feel about those and what we need from another person. So it's competence, so the ability to do the job; openness, transparency that we talked about; integrity, empathy, so looking at something from another's perspective or their shoes; empowerment, and doing all these things consistently. And so identifying what your trust musts are and then sharing them with your colleagues. So as an example, a couple of my trust musts, because integrity and communication or openness are 2 most important of those 6. So doing what you said you're going to do when you said you're going to do it, and being on time are my 2 tops.
Hmm.
Then the communication is, just tell me, even if it's bad news, I just want to hear it. Like, just be super open and transparent with me. So those are my 3 big needs if I'm going to trust somebody. They do none of my team members any good if I don't tell them what they
Yeah,
are.
that's so
How can they
true.
live into that? So I'm
Right.
withholding them to me, just waiting for them to mess up. And that's not fair. That's not giving someone a fighting chance of having a great relationship with me. So that would be an exercise that I would encourage people to do, is to get clear around your trust musts, write them down, share them with your colleagues.
Amazing. Well, I love that advice. Thank you so much. I love your point that you got to share them in order for people to know. We are not mind readers. I love that. Tracy, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I'd love to also ask you, where can listeners connect with you, read your books, learn more about you, and more about this journey toward more trustworthiness?
Great. Books are on Amazon, both of them. And then I'm a prolific poster on LinkedIn. So folks want to follow at Tracy Lalonde on LinkedIn. And then my website, joychiever.com, has all of my offerings, as well as access to the books and other resources and fun stuff there too.
Amazing. Well, I'll link all of that in the show notes so that there's some ease of access there. And again, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. This was a fabulous conversation.
Thanks, Tracy. I appreciate you.
Yeah. Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.